What do those new inflation numbers mean? Are they good news?
Well, I think they're good news if you want interest rates to stay low for a really long time. We know the Reserve Bank governors talked about keeping them around these levels to 2024. And he needs inflation to kick up, as you pointed out, before he would be even contemplating raising interest rates. My concern really is, Rita, that the world is changing so much that the kind of knowledge that people like Terry and myself, relatively young economists like Terry and myself, the kind of stuff that we thought drove inflation is changing right before our very eyes. You look at all the digital disruption out there, just about everything's getting cheaper. And so we don't get inflation the way we used to when you have a booming economy, government spending a whole pile of money. And so I think what we're going to find is what we call in economics a structural change in the nature of inflation. I think it's going to be very hard for the Reserve Bank to actually get it into the 2.5%, 3% range, because the world is just so different. So it's good to see inflation's low, but I just don't think it's going to kick up anytime soon.
Well, that's good for those with massive mortgages, and there's plenty of them out there. We're in the midst of a housing boom. But turning to another issue, left-wing think tank, the Australia Institute, has been accused of wildly overestimating the value of subsidies for fossil fuels. Writing in the Herald Sun today, our man Terry McCrann says the Australia Institute is wrong to classify $7.8 billion worth of fuel tax credits as fossil fuel subsidies. Terry, explain to us why the Australian Institute is wrong.
Well, number one, Rita, the Australian Institute is obviously trying to push a line, which is to destroy the fossil fuel industry, to destroy those coal-fired power stations which keep these lights on, and to drive us into a non-energy, functioning future where we're supposed to get it all from wind turbines and solar panels. So it grabs at anything it can to project its propaganda, and it seized on this figure of $7.8 billion, which is going to be rebated to companies and businesses that pay the fuel excise, like we all do. But it's totally inappropriate for a company to pay the fuel excise as an intermediate cost in its production chain. Just like the GST, companies pay the GST on intermediate goods, but they get a refund of the GST they paid when they sell their goods to the next level. And at the end of the day, the end consumer pays the GST once. And exactly the same logic applies to the fuel tax. So you take the fuel tax rebate out of their calculation, and their claimed massive subsidies to fossil fuel companies, in this case petrol and gas, just don't exist. They shrink to an almost insignificant number, and most of that is simply the building of infrastructure, which everybody gets a benefit from, including companies that are shipping coal down train lines and so on.
Well, Peter, even if the Australia Institute were accurate in their calculations, and Terry just explained why they weren't, does the amount fossil fuel subsidies pale into comparison when you compare it to the subsidies the renewable industry receives?
Yeah, and given the fact that Terry has reduced that number down, and there's, I'm a pretty courageous person, but I'm never going to dispute Terry's calculations. If you put all that together, when you put that all together, you're actually absolutely right. There's an enormous amount of subsidies going to alternative fuels, and I think Terry's right. There's an exaggeration there, and I think the way he's reduced it to the real cost, the real burden, is absolutely sound economics.
Now, sticking with environmental issues, Vogue magazine has published a piece discussing whether having a baby in 2021 constitutes pure environmental vandalism. In the piece, the author suggests for the scientifically engaged person, there are few questions more troubling than looking at the current climate emergency than that of having a baby. Terry, your reaction to that, what would you say to people who are contemplating becoming parents?
Well, the big red warning light goes off when you see that phrase climate emergency. Anybody spruiking anything on the basis of the fake so-called climate emergency immediately invites you not to read any further. But I mean, this is brilliant coming from Vogue magazine. What do they run? You know, the Oscars red carpet was a bit of a dud this year, so they've come up with something new to put on their front cover. What's fashionable this year? 1 baby, 2 babies, or 0 babies? Well, this year, what's fashionable, instead of red and black competing in dress on the dresses, it's 0 babies. It's just ludicrous. I mean, obviously, what are we going to? What's the whole purpose of the planet for? Let's reduce the population to 0, and we'll have absolutely no environmental damage.
Terry, do not give them ideas, because there'll be a piece about that shortly, advocating precisely that position. Now, Peter, if we're all going to stop having babies, what's the point of transitioning to a new green economy?
Yeah, that's a good point, Rita. Look, I think what I get really cheesed off about is that there is this sort of left-wing commitment to the doomsday scenario. And, you know, we saw it when the coronavirus hit. You know, there wasn't a doctor alive telling us that the drug companies could get vaccinations out before the end of the year. They were wrong on that. You know, the magnitude of deaths in countries like Australia are always exaggerated. And what I see with this kind of climate emergency issue that's often raised by extreme left-wing commentators of a green kind is that they just don't believe that mankind can react to the threats to the environment, that all the mistakes that have been made in the past can't be rectified by different actions. I went into a shopping centre on the weekend, and I was staggered to see there was about 10 bays for charging electric cars. And I think probably in the space of probably 10 years, the whole place will be filled with these sorts of things, and the environmental emergency will dissipate, you know, year in, year out as man responds to some of the real concerns around pollution.
Oh, I'm not so sure about that. I think they'll have some other crisis that is about to wipe out the human race at any moment. I wouldn't be surprised if, Terry, if we do all go electric and we have a 2050 target, that there'll be some other emergency to deal with, yes?
Well, the big emergency will be, where will that power come from to fuel those electric cars? I mean, you know, Anthony Albanese came up with a wonderful idea that you can plug in your electric car when you get home at night, and the solar panel on the roof will charge it. Somebody should tell Mr. Albanese that when it's dark, you don't get a lot of power out of solar panels.
No, well, we just won't drive in winter, so that's problem solved. Terry McCrann, Peter Switzer, thank you both for your time this evening.